Hey Code Crew, it's Chris here with another SwiftUI tutorial. Now, if you've built apps in the past, you might be familiar with the MVC design pattern, where M stands for the model. And to put it in simple terms, the model represents your app's data. Well, in SwiftUI, you can use what are called bindings to connect certain parts of your view to properties in the model so that when the data gets updated, the view changes automatically. Furthermore, in SwiftUI, you can have what are called states, and you can have your views react and respond according to different state changes. So this video is all about how data flows from your app models to all of the views in your view hierarchy. So if that sounds good, let's get started. So from the previous two lessons, we've gotten to this point right here where we're displaying a list of data and tapping on one of the rows will actually go to a detail screen. So if you haven't gotten to that point yet, I highly recommend that you check out those two videos by clicking in the upper right hand corner there, and that playlist will bring you to all of the videos that you need to watch. Now there is one correction I want to mention from the last lesson, and that was me struggling to put a navigation bar title at the top of the list here. And it turns out that I was putting it on the wrong element. So instead of putting it on the navigation view, I should have been putting it on the list itself. Now, we were also using display mode of inline. So if we want to follow the Apple sample, so that's what that looks like, we should be using large instead, and that's going to look like this, which looks a lot better. Now in this video lesson, we are following this Apple tutorial right here. So this is actually the third one, handling user input, but one word of warning is that it's really tough to start building off of the previous project we've done, because there are some differences between the starting point of this third lesson versus where we left off here. So I highly recommend that you go to the third lesson, download the project files, and use that starting point. I'll show you two of the differences which really breaks things. So in the project from the second lesson, what we're missing in terms of the landmark structure is we don't have a favorites property. And that's fine. I mean, you can add the favorites property because this video is going to be about toggling favorites and keeping a favorites list. But the bigger problem actually is that the favorites data doesn't exist in our JSON file. So, you know, that's basically the killer right there. Whereas if you download the starting point project from that Apple tutorial, if you check in the landmark data.json file, you'll see that we have some extra pieces of data for each location. isFavorite is featured, which I assumed is going to be used in the future because it wasn't used in this particular lesson, but we do need isFavorite. And inside the landmark here, we do have this isFavorite Boolean property. So yeah, definitely don't build off of your previous project. Instead, download their fresh starting point. And they never really mention that. They never really tell you that that's what you have to do, because these sort of go in order. So the assumption is that you can kind of build off your old project, but that's not really the case. All right, so the first thing we're going to want to do is to go into our landmark row, and we are going to add a little star beside each landmark, depending on whether or not it's a favorite. So from the JSON data, some of them are favorites, some of them are not. And what we're going to do, let's just wait for this preview. What we're going to do, looks like they're missing a spacer here. This is the starting project for their third tutorial. We're going to put a star at the end of the name depending on whether it's a favorite or not. And actually, if it is a favorite, it's going to be a yellow star. So since the landmark actually has a, let me see if I can jump to this class name here. Structure. they have an isFavorite property, we can check that, see if it's true. If it's true, then we're going to show a star. If it's not, then we're going to leave it. So you can actually use an if statement here so that you can conditionally show views or not. So we can say if a landmark is favorite, then we're going to do something. We're going to show an extra image, and there are now system icons. So this one is called 𝗧𝗶𝗺𝗲. And that's going to be a star that you see right there. Now we can change the color of that, and we can also change the size. Because these system icons are in vector format, scaling them up or down isn't going to be a problem in terms of the quality. So we are going to say that foreground color is yellow. And furthermore, we are going to set the scale to medium. All right, so let's wait for that to update. Cool. Now what we've done here is merely display the star if it's a favorite. You can't actually tap on it to toggle it on or off. That's for later on in this video. Now what we're going to do is jump over to landmark list, and we are going to add a toggle to toggle the list whether to show only favorites or all places. So let's go ahead and open up our file navigator and go into landmark list. And this is the perfect time to introduce state. Now state is either a single value or a set of values that can change, and then you can have your view listen to that, that state, and if that state changes, your view can automatically update and change accordingly. So the perfect state for us to add actually is whether or not we should be showing favorites only. So the way we add that state is by declaring a property and then putting a special keyword in front of it called state. So let me show you what that looks like. First, I'm going to declare a property called show favorites only, and I'm going to initially set it to false. And then right in front of it, I don't need that much space, I am going to use this declaration here. A persistent value of a given type through which a view reads and monitors the value. So that's exactly what we need. Now I'm going to hit this resume button on the preview. Nothing changes because we've merely declared the state and we've set it to false, but we haven't added any conditional statements in here to change according to that state. So that's what we're going to do right now. Inside right here. So inside this list for the landmark data, for every single landmark right now, we are creating a navigation button, and inside there is a landmark row. And that basically means we're displaying every single row. Now let's say if the show favorites only property here is true, then we wouldn't want to show every single row, right? We'd only want to show the rows which are favorites. So we can add that statement right here. Check if we should display every single row. So first of all, let's consider the case where show favorites is false. So if show favorites only, so this is basically checking if it's false. So if it's false, right, then we basically want to show everything. So this still makes sense. Oops, right here I am missing something. I have to use the self keyword there. All right, so basically I have an if statement saying that if show favorites only is false, then I should show the button. However, if show favorites only is true, meaning that I only want to see favorites, then I have to consider only showing the row if the landmark is a favorite, right? So I can use an or statement here, and I can check or landmark is favorite. Let me see. Come on, autocomplete. Landmark is favorite. I think this was it. Let me see. Yeah. Now I want to revisit this if statement because I know for a beginner, this sort of logic, sometimes they get hung up on. And so I want to show you that this is basically a shortened way to say something like this. So if show favorites only is false, or self.show favorites only is equal to true, and landmark is a favorite. Oops. So that might be a little easier to understand if you're not used to writing conditions. Right, so only show the row if favorites are false, right, meaning show everything, or if favorites, or if you only want to show favorites and this landmark is a favorite. So that's the more verbose way to write it. Both will get you the same thing. So let's see what we get over here. So if we flip this to true, let's see what we get. So as expected, when we toggle that state property show favorites only to true, in our list we only see landmarks which are marked as favorite. Now we should probably expose some sort of toggle switch to let the user change that state from the user interface, right? And what we can do is we can make the first row of this list the actual toggle switch. Now the only problem is with the way that we've done it here by just feeding the collection of data into the list, and it's just showing a row for each item in that data, we aren't able to change up the first row to what we want. So we are going to have to actually just create a normal list. And then inside that normal list, we're going to set the first row as the toggle switch, and then the subsequent rows as all of the landmarks. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to create some space here. I'm going to create a brand new list. And I'm going to, first of all, create a toggle. So this is a view which is kind of like the UI switch, if you remember back in UI Kit, if you've ever learned the old way of doing things. So what we have to do is specify a binding. Now, this is really cool because we can bind the state of this switch to the state variable. So in order to specify a binding, you use this special character, you use the $ here, and then you write show favorites only. And just like that, the state of this toggle is now bound to show favorites only. And then the label is just going to be a text view, which we can show, we can hit enter here, and then we can create a new text view and say show favorites only. And this preview is still going to be broken right now. Oh, actually it's not. So this is actually a combination of two lists. See, we've got these two here, but I'm actually going to migrate. I'm going to delete this in just a second. I'm going to migrate this code into this new list that I'm creating. So this first row is the toggle. Subsequent rows are the landmarks. So what we're going to do here is we're going to use a for each statement to loop through the landmark data collection. And then for each of those landmarks, we're going to run the same code here. We're basically going to check if it's favorites only or if it's not favorites only, and is the landmark a favorite or not. And then, depending on these different conditions, we're going to show the landmark row or not. So we're not going to change any of this logic. We're just changing up how this is rendered. So let's declare a for each statement here. And we're going to pass in the landmark data. And for each of these landmarks, so we're going to specify a parameter here. For landmark in, we're basically going to take this chunk of code and move it in here, right? And then we can just delete this list. This is our old list. This navigation bar title will still keep, but we're going to attach it to this new list here. So that's this tag right here. I'm getting a lot of nested curly brackets now. So what do we have? Is this working? Ah, there we go. Cool. So you can see that there are no gaps in between the favorites now. If I toggle this off, let's change it to a live preview so we can actually use this. So there, you can see all of the favorites, all of the landmarks, and when you toggle this on, you only see the favorites. Now, it's great that we have a state property to determine whether to show all favorites or not, but we're missing another crucial piece to the puzzle, which is to allow the user to toggle the favorite status of each individual landmark. Now, even if we coded that functionality right now, we would still have to keep that data somewhere, that list of favorite places. So rather than including that data in this view, we should follow best practices, which is to separate views and data, just so it's easier to maintain, and it's just a good practice to do this. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a model object that is going to contain whether or not we should show favorites only. We're going to move this state property into that model, and we're also going to keep the list of the user's favorites in that model object. So that model is going to have all of the data to power this landmark list and also the landmark detail, because that detail screen is where the user is going to be able to set whether that landmark is a favorite or not. So let's take a look at how the data flows from the model into the views. So we're going to create a new class that is going to represent the model for our views. Now in this class, we're going to keep track of two things. The first thing is whether or not the user wants to show favorites only. Now I know we had that state property inside the landmark list to keep track of this, but we're going to move this property into this model class. The second thing we're going to keep track of in this new model class is the list of the user's favorites. Now this is not any old model class, because we're going to use some special SwiftUI magic to make sure that these values flow from the model to the views automatically. And we're going to have to do a couple of different things. One of them is that we have to make this model class conform to the bindable object protocol. And this is going to allow us to sort of attach this model as the data for those views. Second of all, we're going to have what's called a publisher in this model class, and we're going to have our views as subscribers to this model, so that when there are changes to the model inside this data, it's going to publish those changes and notify all of its subscribers, namely our landmark list and our landmark detail views. And that's going to cause them to react and update their views accordingly. Now this whole publisher subscriber pattern is part of the new combine framework. Alright, so now let's jump back into Xcode and let me show you how this all works. Alright, so let's go ahead and create our model class. So I'm going to create it in this models group right here, and we are going to choose Swift file, and I'm going to call this user data. Alright, so we have to import SwiftUI so we can use that bindable object protocol that I was telling you about, and we also have to import the combine framework because that's going to have that publisher subscriber stuff I was telling you about. So we are going to have to create a new user data class in here, and we are also going to make it conform to bindable object. Now let's take a look at this class right here. So I'm going to just pull up the developer documentation. I want to show you some stuff. Oh, actually I had it already open here. So bindable object, an object that serves as the view's model. That's exactly what we want. But down here, I want to show you something. This is a required property here, did change. And what this property references is a publisher object. Now, a publisher, I told you before, emits an event whenever the object changes, right? So we have to declare a property called did change, right? And then we have to assign it a publisher type object. So let's do that. We're going to say equals, And let's go back here. So let's now jump into the, what did I want to show you here? In the combined framework, I want to show you publisher here. Specifically, there are a couple of different types. All right, let's start with this. So a publisher declares a type that can transmit a sequence of values over time, right? So that's kind of what's going to happen here. So we're going to have this publisher referenced by didChange, and then we're going to have our properties for the 𝗧𝗵𝗺𝗀𝗎, and we're going to have our landmarks array here. And if any of that data changes, we're going to call that publisher and make it publish the new data, essentially. So there is a specific publisher type that we want to use. So I'm trying to find it here. So actually scrolling a bit farther down, what we want is something called a subject. And it's a type of publisher here. A publisher that exposes a method for outside callers to publish elements. And if you read this overview down here, a subject is a publisher that you can use to inject values into a stream by calling its send method. So this send method is really important because when some data in our model class is going to change, we're basically going to call the publisher, call its send method, and send along the new data. So which subject do we want to use? Because subject is just the protocol. The one that I learned from the Apple tutorials is this pass-through subject. So they were using this one here, and a subject that passes along values and completion. So I'm going to show you how to use this one right here. And notice that there is output and failure. So I want to talk to you about what that is. I mean, digging through this documentation isn't always that easy, and I don't remember where I read it, but basically I can explain it to you. For output, you basically specify the type of data that is going to be sent through, and failure is where you can send through errors. If it cannot fail, then you just put never in there. So in here, we are going to create a new pass-through subject, and the type of data that that the publisher is going to be sending through is user data. And we are going to say never for the failure because it doesn't fail. And then we are just going to use the parentheses to create a new instance of the pass-through subject. All right, so we can actually get rid of this here as the type. So there it is. So hopefully, yeah, all right, that's cool. Yeah, so now we're going to have our properties to keep track of is show only favorites and landmarks. So this property is just going to be a Boolean property, show only favorites. We'll set it to false to begin with. And this one, we are going to call it landmarks, and we're just going to set it to landmark data. It's basically the array of landmarks parsed from the JSON file. So now how do we detect for changes in these properties? Well, that's nothing new. We had this before. We can just handle, or actually, handle the did set case here. And whenever this property gets changed, basically the code in here is going to fire. And what do we want to do in here? Well, we want to call our publisher. Remember that send method I showed you. And we basically want to send across the user data object itself. So we're going to do the same thing here. We're going to handle did set, and we are going to call our publisher, and we are going to send it this user data. So now whoever is subscribed to this publisher is going to get notified. Now the next step is going to be binding this model object to our landmark list view. So let's go into the landmark list right now. And we're actually going to, let me just go editor only for now. We're going to get rid of this 𝗧𝗵𝗺𝗀𝗎 state property because remember, we've moved this into the user data as a property in our model. So we're actually going to get rid of this line here. Now what we want to do is we want to actually bind this model to this landmark list. And the way we do that is first we need to create a property here that has this special modifier called environment object. And this environment object property is going to have a reference to our user data or our model. So we're gonna, well, let's create the property first. So I'll call this user data. It is a data type of user data, and we're gonna put this special modifier on it. We're gonna say that this property is going to hold the environment object, or in other words, just the model for this view. So before I go ahead and tell you how we're going to set this user data property, let's fix some of the errors that have appeared here. Because this toggle is still bound to that state property that we just deleted, we need to change this so that it references the user data show favorites only property. So what we do instead is we still use this $sign here to indicate that we want to bind this toggle to a property, but it's going to be now bound to the user data show only favorites property. And I think I worded that incorrectly. I'm going to change it to show favorites only. So let's go back to landmark list here. And in here, user data dot show favorites. I guess I didn't save the file because I changed it to show favorites only. So this would be show favorites only. So now this is bound to the user data's show favorites only property. And same thing down here. We have this condition where we check should we show that row, and this is referencing a property that no longer exists. So we are going to change this to user data dot show favorites only, and this one too, user data dot show favorites only. All right, so now we go back to the original question of where do we set the model object to this user data property? Well, you don't explicitly have to assign it to this property. Instead, what you do is you call a special modifier. When you create a new landmark list view, you call the environment object modifier, and then you pass in an instance of the model. So let me show you what I mean. We're going to go into the scene delegate because remember, in here, this specifies the root view, right? And right now, we're creating a new landmark list. So this is actually where we're going to set the environment object here. And we're going to set it to a new instance of user data. Oops, I'm going to make sure that I don't mess up the brackets there. All right, so just by setting this special modifier on the landmark list, that is going to assign this user data object to this environment object user data property. Next up, we have to consider that our user data also contains the list of landmarks. Now, earlier I said that this was the list of the user's favorite landmarks, but I was mistaken. This list is actually the entire list of landmarks. Now, the reason why we don't access the data directly from the view is because, remember, that separation. We want the model to handle all of the data and be kind of the source of that data, and the view to just be responsible for views. We don't want the view accessing the JSON file directly. So we're going to go to the landmark list here, and here we're displaying the rows, and we are passing in, or rather we're looping through the landmark data collection. Now, instead of having this view directly access this collection of data, we want to access the user data dot landmarks, and that should be it for here. So now the next step is to go into our landmark detail view and add a button so that users can toggle whether that landmark is going to be a favorite or not. And that data is going to be written back to the user data model. right? So we're always writing back to that user data model, and we're always reading the data from that user data model. So that model object is going to be the source of the data that powers all of the views here. That way, in the landmark detail view, when the user taps on the favorites button, let's say that they set that landmark as a favorite, that change is going to be written to the model, and then the model, as the publisher, is going to publish that change to all of its subscribers, and those subscribers will update their views according to that new landmark that is a favorite. So let's go into the landmark detail. So it's also got to have a user data property because it's going to be writing and reading from that model, right? So same thing goes here. We're going to declare an environment object called user data. It's going to be a type of user data. Now, like before, you might think that, hey, when we create that landmark detail, where is that? Right here, right? When we create this landmark detail, do we have to specify that modifier and add the environment object modifier and then pass in the user data to it? We actually don't need to do this because what happens is that when we bind this model to that landmark list as an environment object, all of the views inside of this view, like as in all of the subviews, so, you know, landmark detail, landmark row, these are all subviews because landmark list contains them. All of these views automatically get that as their environment object as well. So simply in the landmark detail, simply by having this property, environment object user data here, it's automatically going to be set, and it's going to be set to the same thing as what landmark list has up here. So let's go into the landmark detail view now and add that button. So since we're going to add it beside the landmark name, I'm going to create a new ●stack, horizontal stack. Actually, I'm not going to need to specify any sort of alignment or anything like that. And I am going to put that landmark name in there. And I'm also going to put a tappable button beside it. And this is going to just simply be a star that is, they're essentially going to toggle it. If it's a favorite already, it's going to be filled. And then when they tap on it, it's going to unfill it and unfavorite it. And vice versa. If it was not a favorite before. So I'm going to create a new button, and you have to specify two parameters. The first one is the action. What's going to happen when the user taps on it? Well, we basically want to toggle the favorite status in the user data model. And what the label is what the user sees. Is it a piece of text? Is it an image? So what does the button look like? The first thing I'm going to fill is the action here. So let's think about what we want to do for the code. Essentially, we want to update the isFavorite property of this landmark in the user data model landmarks array. So we're going to need to access this array right here, right? Find out which landmark the user is looking at. And for that, we're going to need to find the index of this landmark inside that array. And then we're going to toggle the isFavorite property. So user data landmarks, and we're going to have to specify some index. We need to look for that. So I'm just going to skip that for now, or maybe it's not going to let me, right? Maybe I have to do that. The isFavorite property, and we're simply going to toggle it. And that's just going to flip it. If it's true, it's going to flip it to false, and if it's false, it's going to flip it to true. Now right here I have 0, and this is literally the first landmark in the list of landmarks. But I can't leave this as 0 because then I would be toggling the favorite status of the first landmark regardless of which landmark the user is looking at. So what I actually need to do is look for the index of the landmark that the user is currently looking at. And so we need to search through this array and find out which index this particular landmark that the user is looking at is. Now I could do that search inside here and create some space, and I can call a method on the array and look for the first index of this landmark inside that array. But then I'd have to also do that again inside the label because I need to access that index again. So I don't want to write that code multiple times in different places. Instead, what we can do to make it a little more efficient is just have a computed property up here called landmark index. And this is going to be an integer type, and it's going to be a computed property. So what we're going to do here is we're going to access the landmarks array of the user data, and we're going to call a method called first index, and it's going to return the first index that matches the condition we're going to put in here. So it's almost like a query. We're going to query by matching the ID of this particular landmark, of the landmark that the user is viewing, against the IDs of the list of landmarks here. And it's going to return the first index of where that condition is true. So in here, we're going to specify that by specifying a symbol closure here. And we're going to use this, this wildcard, and we're just going to compare the ID of the elements inside the array versus the ID of this landmark right here that the user is currently looking at. And since this returns an optional integer, so it could be nil, but we are just going to force and wrap it and return that. It shouldn't be a problem because this landmark was originally from that list, and there's nowhere in this demo app where we're removing landmarks from that list, so it should be okay. Hopefully, fingers crossed. All right, so now back in this button, instead of 0, I can say self.landmarkIndex. Now, as for the label of the button, we're gonna have two options here. If it is a favorite, then we're gonna show a colored yellow star. But if it's not a favorite, then we're going to show an empty star. So let's open up this closure here, and we're going to use an if statement. If userdata.landmarks, we're going to pass self.landmarkIndex, and you see this is where we saved ourselves from having duplicate code because we need to have this index again. We're going to just check if it's a favorite. You know, if it is a favorite, let me just make some more space so it's easier to read. Now, if it is a favorite, then we're going to return an image, which is going to be a system image, and we're going to use that same star icon we used before. So star.fill, and we're going to color the foreground yellow color. So that's going to be representing a favorite. Otherwise, we're going to return an image with the system name just star, and it's not filled. It's going to be an empty star, and we're going to make that that one gray. All right, so now let's try previewing this. All right, so it looks like I have some errors here. Okay. Try again. Cannot preview it in this file. Landmarks may have crashed. All right, let me see what's wrong here. All right, so I'm back, and it took me a little while to figure out what was going on and why my preview was crashing. And when I click this button, it's not really helpful. It says no underlying error, but yet there was an error because it can't actually preview my file. And so I was just double checking my syntax, and then it kind of dawned on me what the problem was, and it turned out to be actually the case. So let me go back to the 𝗧𝗶𝗺𝗀𝗀, and you know how I told you about how inside the landmark list, when we created here and we set the environment object modifier, we pass in a new instance of user data, and then that automatically will set this guy, right? And then it will also automatically set this property in the landmark detail. Now that's all true. I didn't get that wrong. The only problem is this preview, if you remember, is being generated from this second structure, right? From here. And the problem is that there is no environment object binding on the preview. So in here, in landmark list, when I create a new landmark list, there is no environment object binding here. So what I can do is, it doesn't look like, hold on. I don't want to preview on all of these different devices. No, thank you. So here, I can pass in that, right, in my preview, and that's going to be able to show me something. However, in my landmark detail, let's see, because this preview controls what I'm seeing here, right? So it doesn't necessarily translate from that landmark list view. So for this, and only for the preview, I'm going to have to set the environment data for my preview landmark detail view. So then, like in this case, it works for the preview at least. All right, so I can toggle that on and off. And let's say I toggle it off. Can I go back? No. You know what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to preview the landmark list instead. Resume. And I'm going to have to just make this a live preview. And let's just double check. Oh, it's still going. All right, there we go. So I can toggle this. I can drill into Turtle Rock, and I can turn this off and then go back and see it's no longer a favorite. So when I choose show favorites, Turtle Rock doesn't show anymore. So let's choose Rainbow Bay, and let's go ahead and set that as a favorite. And there you go. So just to reiterate what the error was, in case you didn't get it, is that when you're inside landmark detail, let's say you're just working on this view, right? What you see on the right hand side right here is created from this structure, right? And so all we're doing in terms of this piece of code is creating a new landmark detail view and then passing in Turtle Rock, which is the first element of the landmark data. So because we're looking at this independently, just this slice, there was no chance to set this environment object. You know, the scene delegate doesn't get run, landmark list doesn't get run. There's nowhere where this was set. So that's why for this preview, we have to set it right here. When we're looking at the landmark list for this preview, right, when we create this landmark list and then we set the environment object here, this landmark list, when we're playing around with this preview, this landmark list creates those landmark details and stuff like that. So that's why that environment object gets passed into the landmark details that is created from this preview, right? Because this preview is being generated from this piece of code right here, right? And then when you finally run this actual app either on the simulator or on an actual real device, that's when your scene delegate is going to get hit because you're running it for real. You're not working with this preview anymore, right? Your app delegate, your scene delegate, you're going to have your life cycle events here of it launching and all of that stuff. Scene delegate is going to fire. You're going to have this fire. It's going to create a new landmark list and set the root view, and then bind the user data model object as the environment object for the landmark list. So hopefully that makes sense. If it doesn't, just leave me a comment below and I'd be happy to try to explain it in another way. All right, so this SwiftUI bindable object stuff is pretty cool, but at the same time, it takes a little bit to wrap your head around. I'm still trying to wrap my head around it. I think that I might create a standalone video just explaining this concept a little farther down the line. And if that's something that you want to see, please consider thumbs upping this video and subscribing to my channel if you haven't already. That sort of stuff really helps support the channel and keeps it going. And now I want to turn it over to you. Have you used UIKit before? And if you have, how do you think it compares to SwiftUI? Do you like UIKit better or do you like SwiftUI better? Let me know by leaving a quick comment below. There's more SwiftUI content over there. Thanks for watching. I'll see you guys next time.